Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's exclusive webinar featuring two of our leading voices in economic development. Our webinar today is entitled Fostering an Inclusive Recovery, How the Economic Development Administration is Building Back Better Through the America Rescue Plan Investments. I am Dominica Lynch, the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Latinos and Society program. Our mission is to empower Latino communities and promote long-term economic growth and resiliency. I invite you to visit the Aspen Institute website to learn more about our programs, in particular our Aspen City Learning and Action Lab, the way that we're working with local leaders to ensure that we're strengthening local entrepreneur ecosystems and bringing them closer to federal policymakers and diverse capital providers. So please learn more about our programs. On behalf of our board of advisors, thank you for being here today and for all that you are doing in your communities to bring back our economy. As we battle the ongoing COVID-19 Omicron surge, I want to encourage you to please get vaccinated, boosted, and take extra precautions recommended by the CDC. We're 2 weeks into January. It's still beginning of a year. 2022 is about new beginnings. And we know that together we will get through this uncertainty. We're going to innovate in ways that will ensure that Latino businesses not only recover, but prosper and create new jobs. It is such an honor to welcome someone that's very special to the Aspen Institute. Today, our special guest is U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development, Alejandra Castillo. Assistant Secretary Castillo has an extensive and distinguished career in public service, previously serving as the National Director of the Department of Commerce Minority Business Development Agency and holding several senior policy positions at the White House and the International Trade Administration. Assistant Secretary Castillo is also a very proud first-generation American of Dominican descent and comes from a long line of entrepreneurs. She understands both the unique needs and the challenges facing Latino entrepreneurs and other underserved populations. In today's discussion, Assistant Secretary Castillo will walk us through how the EDA is leading the federal economic development agenda and how through its $3 billion in economic development funding is focused on economic resiliency, establishing new wealth creation pathways, and committed to creating the jobs of the future. Most importantly for you is really understanding what you can do to better align your efforts at the local level and ensure that you're maximizing this moment in time as the EDA deploys federal investments. So to guide today's conversation, it is my honor to introduce our moderator, co-founder, and executive director for the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University, Bruce Katz. Bruce formerly served as the inaugural Centennial Scholar and Vice President at the Brookings Institution, where he also founded the Metropolitan Policy Program. Bruce advises American and European federal, state, and local leaders on shifting demographic and market trends, as well as policies that are critical to metropolitan prosperity, and also the ways to innovate new forms of metropolitan governance. We are especially honored to lean on Bruce as our senior advisor for the Aspen City Learning and Action Lab program. So we are delighted to kick off this meeting to have a conversation that is transformative because you have two leading voices here, someone that's heading up a $3 billion investment and someone that has been an expert for so long for many of our American cities. And so want to encourage you to participate. Please make your comments in the chat. Take an opportunity to also write us a question and put those in the Q&A box. We want to leave about 15 minutes of the discussion so that you have a chance to interact with our special guest today. So with that, it's an honor to welcome and to introduce Bruce. So please take it away.
Thanks, Dominica. And first of all, kudos to you and your remarkable staff. I think what you're building in Aspen is so distinctive. It really is a think and do tank of sorts and a node between cities, the federal government, and capital providers. Assistant Secretary, it's absolute pleasure to be with you today. I think EDA is emerging, as in all administrations, as a hotspot for industrial policy, competitive policy, particularly for those places left behind in the prior economy, and particularly as we move, hopefully, out of the pandemic more quickly. I thought we might just start so everyone on the chat could begin to understand, literally, where are you coming from? What has your journey looked like? Because you're taking the helm of an agency that hasn't played this role in the past. And as we all know, our past does inform our present and future. So just a little bit on yourself before we get started.
Sure, Bruce, and thank you, Dominica, for that very gracious introduction. And Bruce, I think you and I will have some fun with this panel. And I say fun in the sense of really digging deep into what's happening right now. So a couple of things. I grew up in Queens, New York. My father was a bodega owner in the Bronx, and I have to take a minute to recognize the fires that just broke out in the Bronx and the tremendous loss of life. Many of them of Dominican descent, which is my cultural heritage. And I remember those days. It was the 70s. The city was in a terrible fiscal situation. Neighborhoods were really abandoned. And I always wondered, how does the economic engine of a city function? And I realized there's a formal economy and then there's an informal economy. So a lot of my early career was in the informal economy. I actually worked in drug control policy, looking at drug trafficking, drug interdiction, money laundering, issues in that realm. But then I went into entrepreneurship, looking at minority businesses and how do we help them grow and scale and go into diversify into areas of international trade, looking at access to capital, access to market, access to contracts. We'll talk about contracts in a minute, federal contracts in particular. And then I led the YWCA, one of the oldest women's organizations in the country, with over 200 associations across the country, really having the finger on the pulse of communities, in particular women and people of color, and looking at how do nonprofits not only have the finger on the pulse, but also help in terms of investing in communities. And I know that there's some folks from El Paso, and I have to give a shout out to the YWCA of El Paso because they do some incredible work. All of that, as you mentioned, the lived experience is what informs us. I'm a student of government, so my job has always been to figure out how does government play a role in creating the ecosystem that can help really nurture ideas, innovation, entrepreneurship, the wellness, the resiliency of communities. So that in a nutshell is a 30-year journey that now has brought me to EDA, which specifically I love. I was at Commerce during the Obama years, and I watched EDA. And at that time, it was a $300 million organization, a $300 million bureau, which looked and seemed like a lot. But now we are $3 billion plus, with a mandate of really helping communities not just survive this pandemic, but truly build themselves to be able to thrive. And that's the exciting part. It's the exciting part because as you and I talked before this conversation started, it allows us to be architects of the future. What do we need to make sure that our communities have as part of their ecosystems? What type of ingredients of systems of support? So I'm sure we're going to go dive into that even more, but it's exciting times. And this is the conversation we all need to be having, because we're talking about not just today, but what's happening 25 years down the road in terms of workforce development, industries, sectors, resiliency, and the like. So thank you for the question, Bruce.
Well, you really are the right person for this job. Thank President Biden. So let me ask you this question about EDA, because you have $3 billion in the American Rescue Plan, Build Back Better, Good Jobs Challenge, tourism, et cetera. It really is almost a precursor of what we're going to see in the infrastructure bill, with a lot of competitions. But in some ways, the way you've managed this is to teach, so to speak, an old dog new tricks. The way you structured the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, so there were 2 phases, enabled you to build capacity. So it's not just that applicants win government awards, but that applicants put together market strategies and coalitions that really can attract private investment and grow quality jobs for the long haul. So how do you take an older agency and really have it reboot, retool for this dramatic sort of responsibility that you have?
It's interesting because the essence of EDA, if you looked at EDA staff, they are former Peace Corps volunteers. They are individuals who worked in our armed services. They are individuals for whom community is at the core. Team building is at the core. So you're right. It's not, going from a $300 million to a $3 billion plus, because we also have to account for the 1.9 billion in CARES. The scaling is not a 1+1. The scaling really is exponential, and looking at not just the talent that we have at EDA, but the commitment to mission. And I'll tell you, I wish I could take credit for this, but this is my team. Individuals like Michelle Chang and Scott Andes and Todd Fisher and so many individuals, and the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, who came together, and we put spaghetti on the wall, we tested it, we went back, we re-engineered. And that's the exercise that I think as a nation we're doing today. It's looking at how do we do economic development and break the model where it needs to be broken and reinforce the model where it needs to be reinforced. So these are the type of exercises that we're nimble enough to be able to do. And we're also passionate about making sure that we meet communities where they're at. This cannot be a Washington top down. It really has to be from the community level. Hence why the American Rescue Plan grants were designed with partnership and coalitions in mind. And the dollars are large enough that it really breaks the paradigm of a zero-sum game. It breaks the paradigm because unless you come together in coalition and partnership, you don't have a bite at the apple to the larger chunks of dollars. So there's a lot that went into it, and it's so far so good. We just announced the 60 finalists, but we received 529 applications, Bruce, unheard of. And these are type of partnerships that, of course, they wanted to be able to get the dollars at the end of the day, but they've also told us that whether or not they got the Build Back Better grant, they were still going to continue to partner. And that is game changing.
As you're talking, what's interesting to me, I was chief of staff at HUD for Henry Cisneros. And when we thought about some of our audiences, you might have a public housing program, and then it would be a vertical to a public housing agency and tenant associations and so forth. Your ecosystem is really an interesting mix of anchor institutions, universities, mature companies, startup, scale up, accelerators, incubators, investors. The fact that you have a good jobs challenge in the Commerce Department is remarkable, but you're connecting the dots between workforce development and economic development. You may have one of the broadest audiences, really eclectic audiences of any agency. And so in some ways, what you're doing is almost helping to bulk up the capacity of these networks and ecosystems, because when they work well together, it's like the gift that keeps on giving. In many respects. So I think that's really interesting. And how do you go about both dealing with different aspects of the network, but also these coalitions that are emerging from these different programs?
Yeah, and as you well pointed out, and as somebody who's worked in government, that sometimes we can be very siloed. What the American Rescue Plan has allowed us to do, and the situation with the pandemic even more so, is to have almost forced our hand to really think about how do we tear down those silos within government, right? How does EDA and Department of Labor and Department of Education come together to tackle workforce development, with each of us using our toolbox, our unique toolbox? And while Department of Labor and Education do an extraordinary job within workforce, we at Commerce, and the Secretary in particular understand this very well because she was very successful in Rhode Island, was to understand that we are in touch with employers and employees. How do we shorten that communication and that upskilling and opportunities to not only provide workforce development, but to lead to a job, and not just any job, but a high-paying job, a job of the future. And again, you're going to hear this word a lot, future, 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 because that's where our eye is. How do we prepare today to make sure that that ecosystem that we talk about is really ripe to prepare communities for the future, whether it's technology driven or, you know, dealing with a pandemic as we're in this situation right now, or generational changes, you know, or demographic changes as we think about Latinos being the fastest growing segment of our population. How are we going to address that and really bring diversity as our strength across the board?
So you bring up the future, and I think, well, why don't we stay on that? And then I want to ask you some questions about the Latino Marketplace, which is remarkable. What I found in looking at a lot of the Build Back regional challenges, and for everyone on this webinar, if you have a couple hours, read these applications. They're like 5 pages long, the conceptual narrative for the phase 1. And it's really interesting to see how dozens and dozens of American cities, metros, rural areas, states are talking about their existing clusters, but then describing what the future might look like. The future could be around different supply chains. We don't have to outsource our manufacturing to Asia and beyond. We can bring much of this back either because of quality or because of disruption. Remote work and what that might mean for different spatial geographies. Technologies themselves and how technologies might be used to reduce health disparities or crack at other social or climate issues. So I think what you're describing in a way is we're not just providing a platform for today's jobs, we're really providing a platform for tomorrow's technologies and jobs. Talk a little about that, because I think it could bring a lot more American cities, metros, regions into the mix than pre-pandemic in many respects.
Oh, absolutely. And as I mentioned, we received 529 applications for 60 slots. And in that challenge, as you say, and I just put on the chat the link to the 60 finalists, and these are only the finalists. We had such an array, whether it was aerospace, quantum computing, agrotech, cybersecurity, you know, such an array of industries, sectors, ideas. And I have to also put a plug in, because this is under the American Rescue Plan. With Build Back Better legislation, which I hope we can support the president and get it to the finish line. There's another component that EDA will play a very important role, which is the tech hubs. And that stands between right now between $3 and $8 billion. We don't know where it'll land, but it is really transformative because it's a way to democratize technology and innovation so that it doesn't only live in Silicon Valley or other places, very select places across the country, but that we actually find ways to leverage technology innovation and tech commercialization to help in areas where before you couldn't even fathom it. And this is where, going back to Latino businesses, this is where the beauty of supporting Latino businesses in terms of building capacity, but also diversifying, going into those sectors, or into those spaces. Just a side note, in the infrastructure bill, there's $2.5 billion for electric vehicle charging stations. How do we get more Latino-owned businesses into that sector? Because it's not just creating the stations, it's going to be maintaining it. And let's go back to future. Just like 100 years ago, folks could not fathom having a gas station in every corner, or at least, you know, close to every corner. 100 years from now, we're going to have electric vehicle charging station potentially in every corner, if not in every house. So it is a sector that is towards the future. And it's a sector where there's going to be a stimulus for federal procurement opportunities for Latino-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses writ large. So I'm trying to weave all of this together because there's a lot to digest, but there's a lot of amazing opportunities coming down the pipe.
You know, so in some respects, EDA is a really interesting mix because in some ways, SBA is focused on the entrepreneurs, HUD is very place focused, and you know, housing focused. You're sort of an amalgam. You're both trying to reduce the disparities that Latino entrepreneurs now experience, but you're also trying to reduce spatial disparities in the country. If I think about a lot of, and Dominica and Alejandro and others have taught me this, if you think about the Inland Empire, Central Valley, or many majority Latino communities, they're not Silicon Valley, right? They have excellent universities, they have distinctive clusters, but they're not at the front end of technological innovation. They might be on the deployment end. It seems like you're disrupting that, both for entrepreneurs and for places.
Yeah, but I'll also say it's we're still focused on place, right? Place is inevitable. It's geography. It's where we tether ourselves, our families, our businesses. But you're right, we're trying to bridge that. So when we look at not just urban areas, and we're also looking at suburban and rural areas. We're looking, the inland region in California did get a became a Build Back Better finalist, which is fantastic. But so did other rural areas across the country. We're also looking at coal communities and the diversification and transformation of coal communities. So there's a lot that has to do with geography and place. But again, it's looking at not just being tethered to geography and place as your defining criteria, but leveraging geography and place as your source of comparative advantage, right? So again, there's a lot that goes into it. And there's also the beauty that we're living in a moment in time where labor and talent is fluid. How do we make sure that capital investments, ideas, and innovation continues to be equally as fluid? So there's a lot to contend with, and right now we're working on clearly very distressed communities, but we're also trying to make sure that we're preparing those distressed communities to that moment in time when they can actually be catapulted by some very strategic investments from EDA.
I think the level of intentionality and purpose here is really quite striking, because if you look at the current state of Latino small business owners, they are over-concentrated in the food sector, and they're over-concentrated in construction and aspects of the construction sector. And that may work quite well, actually, as infrastructure spending begins to go out, and they can move from being subprimes to primes, and particularly participate both, not just in construction, but pre-construction, architecture, engineering, environmental impact. So there's a sector focus you have to bring these firms, really diversify Latino entrepreneurs across multiple sectors, particularly those that are high wage, quality jobs, fast growth trajectories. It seems like we almost need a coalition of the HSIs, of other universities, mature tech companies, a full-in kind of set of efforts here to bring along a whole set of new entrepreneurs. The dynamism of this could be quite remarkable, actually.
Yeah, and it's already happening. I'll just say on a personal note, indeed, as immigrants, we start with those businesses that have the least barrier, and those businesses for which we can master as quickly as possible in order to create jobs for our families, create wealth for our families. But as the generations go by, you'll see the next generation either venture into a diverse sector, or sometimes not at all. And that's where we need to be very careful. How do we help small business, minority-owned businesses to really diversify, maintain a succession plan of sort, so that they can definitely migrate into those sectors that have a much higher profit margin. But we have to think about also the succession planning of these existing small businesses. That's one point I'll tell you. The other part of EDA is, again, let me go back to the ecosystem. And this is where we're engaging, mayors and state and local officials, because we want to make sure that, for example, we are the traditional public works. We do a lot of work with regards to water and water treatment and sewage. If you're in a community where that system is 100+ years old and it's creating health issues or access issues, we do that type of work as well. the type of infrastructure that no one sees, but for whom all of this rests upon. We also do work in broadband, and we work very closely with NTIA, the National Telecommunication and Information Agency, which, by the way, just got $65 billion under the infrastructure bill. And communities like Latino communities must be part of that conversation with NTIA. So you're right, we are a hodgepodge of different efforts, but at the end of the day, it's about what are the elements that make community resilient and successful? And it can be just about so many different things. So we're trying to be cautious not to overextend ourselves, but we are also experts in the field of looking at both the infrastructure as well as looking futuristically in terms of the things that can actually transform communities.
Let me ask you this question about the Latino marketplace and international trade, because this has been part of your experience as well. So in many respects, what we're talking about, particularly with future-oriented industries, is not just our domestic market, but all of Latin America, starting in Mexico, obviously, but also Spain. And so how do we think about that aspect of sort of, really taking Latino entrepreneurs to a much higher level of economic impact for themselves, their communities, but also for the country?
Well, I will tell you, when I led the Minority Business Development Agency, at the time, the Obama administration had an agenda to double exports in 5 years. Right. And we focused on minority businesses because minority businesses are twice as likely to export because of linguistic and cultural ties. I'll tell you again, on a very personal note, as a child, I remember my parents buying things and putting them in a box and shipping them to the DR and reselling them. That is trade. It's an informal way of trade, but we recognize our markets of origin, as well as we understand the opportunities that exist. And there are a lot of businesses for whom trade is at the core. I'll also tell you that I took a delegation of minority-owned businesses to Hannover Messe trade fair, which is extraordinary in Germany. And to this day, though, that delegation is doing incredible work in the international trade space, specifically with technology. So there's and we're not limited to Latin America. We're exploring in the African continent, in Asia, and different places, because we see the potential. So more than just exposing, it's also making sure that we have the access to capital, that we have the legal requirements, making sure that we have patent and trade issues that we're protecting as we go internationally, that we're looking at procurement opportunities, whether it's through the IDB or other contracting opportunities. So there's a lot, but there's a need for education, as well as being able to tell Latino-owned businesses what are the resources within the government that can help not only help you expand your trading markets, but also protect your intellectual property.
Okay, just one quick question. I grew up in Brooklyn, so you grew up in Queens, but your dad had a bodega in the Bronx. So are you a Yankees or a Mets fan?
I'm a Mets fan. Grew up 5 blocks away from Shea Stadium, now called Citi Field, but we won't get into that.
Okay, because otherwise I was going to have to cut this short.
Well, but let me tell you why I'm a Mets fan, because the Mets was the first baseball team to have a Dominican in the business of baseball, not just as a player, but as a manager. And that's core to my beliefs, that in order for us to help our talent pool, we have to open up opportunities at the upper management. So that's a short story as to why, and that was Omar Minaya, by the way.
That's right. No, so, okay, we can continue then.
Yes.
I think in many respects, and in some ways, I think we heard more about this 10 years ago in the aftermath of the Great Recession than we do now, for obvious reasons. But diversity in this country as a platform for natural, authentic trade and foreign investment is something that I don't think is really talked about very often. Yeah. But it's one of our strengths. and it's completely unique compared to the rest of the world. So we could be dealing with, Chile or Argentina or Colombia at the same time, dealing with Asia and all the rest. And you're in EDA's in a very interesting sort of juncture point, because you're representing these ecosystems, which is the foundation for a lot of the industry trade that's going to emerge going forward.
Yeah. And we also have to recognize that whether we speak about immigration or we speak about Latino community that has been here for generations, the fact that, in terms of building creating businesses and growing them has also been transformational for many downtown areas in towns and cities across the country, which have seen a resurgence of their downtown areas because of newcomers who are willing to take that risk that sometimes people are no longer willing to. But it's that grit, if you will, where we're seeing individual, economic development happening. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're talking about Latinos, but I can give you an example of so many diverse communities and groups that are doing just that in towns all across the country. And it's really beautiful to watch, because they're bringing economic life back in a number of ways, whether it's with your restaurants, but also with big companies as well. So you're seeing how important diversity is. And in the chat, I also put the link to EDA's investment priorities, where equity is at the top of the list. So I want to make sure that folks understand that we have a commitment to equity beyond words and anchored on action.
Here's a question about, public and private capital. So a lot of focus, not surprising, 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, 1.2 trillion Infrastructure Act, and now maybe a reconciliation bill, we hope. There is so much private capital out there. I mean, it's just stunning because of the run up in the stock market, et cetera. How do we begin to bring more of that capital that's fit to purpose for a continuum of Latino entrepreneurs? Because I think there's some movement, but it's not quite at the scale which could occur. And again, EDA is in this interesting space to help motivate and catalyze that.
Yeah, so you said it's not at the scale, and I would also add not at the speed that we need it to be deployed, right? So two elements that I think we need to tackle. I believe in government. I believe that government paves the road where, no pun intended, where others have been a bit more timid to do. I think that the infrastructure bill is going to not only deploy capital, construction investments across the board, but it's also going to unleash a lot of creativity, innovation, which I'm hopeful that it will incentivize the private sector, because one thing we know about the private sector, they don't want to be left behind. So there's a momentum building that we have to triangulate. How does government make these critical investments, takes the first so to speak risk in the investment, but then opens up the field for private investments to partner with Latino-owned businesses, to partner with state and local communities. And I think we're doing that. I'll also tell you that we're engaging with philanthropy, because philanthropy is another huge sector that is sitting on $1.3 trillion of capital, and incentivizing philanthropy to make to partner with communities. One thing I will tell you about EDA is that we do have a match. It's congressionally required. We do have a match that is where for every proposal you have to bring 50%. It could go all the way down to 20%, but you still have to have a match, and that's understandable. But in that process of a match, we want to bring in philanthropy to be that partner, so that it's not just government and communities, but that the philanthropic community is also involved. And we have proposals and projects that are in some ways almost shovel ready, where philanthropy can really dig deep. And I'm trying to like take the excuse out of we can't find them or we don't know where they are, and really saying, here they are, we have them. These are communities that are distressed and that need this investment in capital.
So we're a few minutes away from people asking their questions and answers. It really feels like this is not your parents' EDA. I mean, it feels, I mean, this just is like a whole nother world here. Partly because of the funding and the resources that you've been provided through the American Rescue Plan, or hopefully will come through the reconciliation bill. I mean, if we had 3 to 8 billion for tech hubs, I mean, that would just be a remarkable set of investments.
Yeah, but let me put it into context as well. I would say that maybe this is the level that EDA should be at.
Total.
Because $300 million for the last 20 years has put us at the bottom of our OECD partners when it comes to economic development. And as a nation of our size and scale, arguably, should we be at $300 million? One would submit, maybe not. Maybe we need to be at a $3 billion. So maybe what's happening is we're also playing catch up. And I thank the president for his vision, because the Build Back Better legislation is exactly that, putting us back into a competitiveness that is going to really help communities across the country.
What I also take from this conversation, which it was just so interesting to hear you talk about EV charging, because, so much in the federal government, everyone stays in their lane. And, it's agency X or sub-agency Y, and this is what we do, and just crowd out the noise, And by your bringing up EV charging, I think, in a way, that sector focus, where is the puck going, How do we begin to bring Latino, Black-owned business into those parts of our economy that 25 years from now are going to really be dominant in many respects as we electrify the auto sector, move to autonomous vehicle? I mean, all these industries are going through dramatic change. It's that kind of intentionality that I think will bring a lot more private and public players along for the ride.
And government needs to be the model, right? So in that conversation of electric vehicle charging, I'm partnering with MBDA, Minority Business Development Agency, which, by the way, just got authorized for the first time in 52 years. And now they're receiving $1.1 billion, which is a magnitude of its previous budget unheard of, but finally very necessary. So MBDA, under the leadership of Miguel Estienne, and I want to give him a shout out because he's doing such an incredible job, is also becoming that voice that we have been wanting to be for such a long time, to bring in minority-owned businesses, Latino-owned businesses. And we said we were going to talk a little bit about federal procurement. Again, the government leads the way. 23% of government contracts need to go to small businesses, and there's a whole different category. How are we going to ensure that the infrastructure bill makes imperative federal contracting for minority-owned businesses? So again, government leads the way, much to some people's chagrin, but it's essential. It's essential. And then hopefully we set the landscape, we set the ecosystem so that others can follow suit as well. So there's a lot happening, but you're right. We have to really be looking at where will the puck land, not today, but 25 years from now.
I think Dominique is coming back.
Okay.
Can
I turn the table for a minute? Because I wanted to ask you a question, Bruce. Again, we've been talking about the future. What are you seeing? I mean, you have the finger on the pulse on so many different issues, and you are such a revered voice in this sector. I'd love to know, what are you seeing and what are you thinking about as you continue these many, many efforts that you're doing right now?
So here's where I'm worried, and then I'll tell you what I'm excited about. Where I'm worried, I think there's a lot of parasitic money out there, particularly in the real estate sector. And I think it's moving into, parts of the country, neighborhoods of the country, buying up large volumes of inventory. to move from owner to renter without really a long-term, interest in wealth building. The other money that's moving right now is, I think investors, institutional investors, universities, philanthropies, pension funds, et cetera, they're baking in remote work, and they're beginning to invest in companies that can basically serve corporations with virtual collaboration. That is a good thing, I presume, from an efficiency perspective. It could undermine some of our downtowns and central business districts that, if everyone goes to 3 days a week at the office, 2 days a week at home, what's going to happen to all those small businesses in downtowns and employment areas that really, were there for the office work or for others? And I think there's some things that have been unleashed by the pandemic that investors, large amounts of capital, are basically moving right now, and the public sector is usually behind that because private money just moves so fast. On the positive side, I think the U.S. has the ability to lead if you can get some more of these bills passed. We can have a burst of competitive energy and technological innovation in next generation sectors, particularly around climate, and particularly around using the market to crack at social issues like health disparities. But we need more of that public sector platform, as you've described, to basically unlock all that and unleash all that. But it's there to be had, and I do think it's a natural for Latino entrepreneurs and other entrepreneurs to occupy what is the next space in a way. But I have, so I'm from Brooklyn, so everything's positive and negative simultaneously, right? So, I mean, as you know.
I love it. Thank you for that. I know that Dominica has joined us again, and I know there's a lot of questions on the chat and then the Q&A box, Dominica.
Yes, there are. Thank you so much. We can listen to you a bit longer. So thank you both for your time. So the first question that we have is many of the finalists in the Build Back Better Regional Challenge were government agencies and universities. How will the EDA ensure that Latino COBs and chambers are able to compete and win these competitive grants, given that Latino communities are such an important focus of this work?
Yeah, and I know that question came from Brent, my friend Brent Wilkes. Actually, Brent, I will tell you that we have some very strong Latino organizations, and one of the finalists in New Mexico was the Latino Chamber of Commerce. So I think twofold. One is we've done a lot of outreach, but we want to engage more with organizations like yours and others to make economic development a top agenda item as we move forward. Right now, I wanted to also underscore that we have the Good Jobs Challenge, which I'll put on the chat. That deadline is February 10th. And that deadline, similar to the Build Back Better, requires a consortium of partners. So I would recommend, like, how can we support and make sure that more Latino organizations are pursuing these opportunities. And again, these are opportunities that are at the local level. So there's a lot of strategizing that has to happen at the local level, which, I think that you all do a fantastic job on that front. But I really think that it's also about making sure that we are providing as much information and support and making sure that economic development is a top priority for the Latino community. And I know that it is, please don't get me wrong, but I'm also thinking of carving out conversations specifically on economic development and entrepreneurship so that they both go hand in hand.
Amazing. Let us know how we can help.
Yep.
All right, the next question is from Griselda Martinez. How is the EDA incentivizing philanthropic support and working with communities?
Yeah. So thank you for that. We actually have a philanthropic convening, and what we've been working with philanthropy is to make available all of these amazing proposals for those who are invested in ESG and environmental social governance, who have the dollars to be deployed, putting them in contact with communities all across the country so that it's not just the usual places. but that they can also look at, whether it's rural areas, which, by the way, rural America does have a lot of Latinos, as well as making sure that they have a much broader reach of ideas. So these are conversations that are happening. As government, we can't tell philanthropy what to do, but we can at least make it available that there are enormous opportunities to be had, as well as partnerships. Because again, when you look at the fact that philanthropy is sitting on $1.3 trillion through donor advised fund and all the others, I'll take a bold risk and say, please don't tell me you can't find us, right? That's a tough one. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is from Erica Mesker. You noted that there are communities that are shovel ready and looking for matching funds. How can we learn about these organizations and communities and connect?
Yeah, and that was, thank you for the question. That's what we're trying to solve for, because we got the proposals. We're connecting them with philanthropy in particular, because they have certain capital. But we also made them, we also had a very transparent process. So if you look at the Build Back Better website, you will see all 529, basically 529 proposals, but specifically the 60 finalists that are involved as well. And, EDA has 6 regional offices. We have offices in Seattle, Chicago, Atlanta, Austin, Philadelphia, and I'm missing one, so forgive me. And these regional offices cover the entire country. So those regional offices are also great partners to look at opportunities. One last thing I will tell you, we've talked a lot about the American Rescue Plan. That is one funding source, but we have funding available for technical assistance, for economic strategic planning through our Economic Adjustment Assistance Fund. As well as through the travel and tourism, which is part of the American Rescue Plan as well.
Thank you for mentioning that. It's an opportunity for a wide variety of nonprofits to apply. Lily Ganges, with government contracts and funding taking a longer period, what are shorter term strategies 1 to 2 to accelerate opportunities?
So I'm very passionate about government procurement, but government procurement is not for the faint of heart, right? It's challenging, it's cumbersome. It requires a lot of different working strategies. So a couple of things, and this is more wearing my MBDA hat from long ago than my EDA hat, but how do you become federal contract ready? Government sometimes asks you for past performance. Do you partner with a company that has past performance so that you can get into the mix? How do you have in the infrastructure and construction area, how do you secure bonding? But a lot of networking as well, right? This is the moment for to do a lot of what's called capture management, which is looking at what are the contracts that are coming down the pike, making sure you have your feasibility statement ready, making sure that you're connecting with individuals in the different departments, and think about the federal government writ large. But sometimes you may want to start with your local and state government. That in itself becomes an opportunity. So I know that Dominica, in the work that you're doing with Latino entrepreneurs, that's a big part of the conversation. But again, this is the moment for us to be very prepared, because those procurement opportunities are going to come very fast, but they may not come necessarily via the federal government. Much of these dollars are going to go to the states. So pay attention to what's happening at the state level as well.
Bruce, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think it's brilliant to really mention capture management and really get ahead of the curve. And I do think what, Dominica and I were talking to the SBA administrator and the associate administrator last week. And I think there may be lessons learned out of direct federal spend at a DoD joint venturing or GSA that can be applied to this distributed federal spend that's moving through states and locals. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, the Hispanic chambers and the entrepreneurial support organizations who know the firms. I mean, that's what's so interesting. They're the high touch intermediaries. And so we need to identify which of those firms are already in a space which in 3 to 5 years can take them on a revenue growth trajectory, subprime to prime. I like this capture management piece, I think is really quite interesting.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I've had experiences where folks want to do business at the Department of Commerce with the Census Bureau. You know, we have a census every 10 years, and they'll come in at year 8 of the planning process.
Right.
That's too late. I mean, it may be arguably interesting to do it, to get engaged now, which gives you. So again, that's why I say that government procurement is not for the faint of heart, because it does take time. But that's why we need to diversify both the state, local, and federal government business activities to make sure that you are well diversified across the spectrum.
We have three minutes left. I'm going to take a couple questions. This next question is from Roberto Franco. How do you get federal employees to share the same passion that you do and implement the programs in a timely manner and not get political?
I'll tell you, at EDA, I have found that my colleagues have the same passion. It's contagious, because as I mentioned, they come into EDA with a understanding of community as well as an understanding and desire to transform. Surely you'll find those who may not be as enthusiastic, but again, I believe in government, and I also recognize that career civil servants they are the soul of the mission, regardless of administrations. And whatever you may think about the Biden administration or the previous administration, career civil servants are really there to keep the momentum, keep the energy and the innovation. So I trust that there are great career civil servants who are the ones who keep this moving. I'm just a temporary custodian of EDA. The soul of EDA are the incredible career individuals.
I would say you're a fantastic steward, that's for sure. One question that comes to mind is just, in the name of efficiency, sometimes we trump equity. So how is that, how are you guarding that from happening right at this moment in your agency?
Yeah, so we have a very deep commitment to equity. And trust me, I'm asking the questions much to my colleagues' chagrin, because I'm asking the whys. You know, why are we doing it this way and not that way? Why are we using this particular data and not another data? There are so many ways to measure communities and where they're at. And sometimes it's even measuring capacity. Capacity can be an impediment to how communities apply for EDA grants. So we're looking at it very broadly. We're looking at not only what are we investing in today, but what have we invested historically? Where are the gaps? How do we engage communities and different stakeholders? Because again, my experience is that we need to engage more stakeholders, and the Latino community is one that we are very, very focused on. And my colleague Bernadette Hobson is one that's really like, you know, she is diligent on making sure that we are talking to all the different stakeholders and getting them involved.
Well, one final question, I think it's a timely one. For the Good Jobs Challenge, there was an intent to apply email due last week. Mm-hmm. Can organizations still apply without that intent to apply email?
Yes. And that was stated in the notice of funding. So yes. Think about it as a way for us to gauge how much interest there is. So please apply. That notice of intent does not impede you from moving forward. So by all means, put those applications in, focus on your partnerships, focus on how you're going to implement. But most importantly, just know that it's one of the very few grants that also allows for wraparound services. So this is where collaboration is going to be critical. It's not just a straightforward workforce development. It's a whole ecosystem of players and engagement that we're looking for.
It's one of our favorite words over here. There's one final question I'm going to take a minute to ask. With government contracting a long process, what are the short-term strategies to accelerate the opportunity?
Sure. Mentor-protege relationships. And I know that in the business sector, people don't necessarily like to do this mentor-protege kind of relationships. But think about it this way: it's better to own half of something than 100% of nothing. And with mentor protege programs that exist, and SBA has fantastic mentor protege programs, it allows you to also do knowledge transfer. So you're learning from the company that has the government experience, and you're being able to go through it, take it in chunks. Because the other thing about government procurement is it's large scale. So you want to make sure that not only do you have the capacity to manage the grant, but the capacity to deliver on the grant. So there are a lot of other techniques, and I'm sure Dominica, our colleagues, our friends at SBA can walk them through, as well as our friend at MBDA. So I hope that at some point you invite Miguel to one of these chats.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for your time. This was a lot of fun, and I appreciate just bringing your humanness, your personal story into this, because sometimes we forget that the stats are people on the ground, and these lived experiences matter. So we appreciate you both, and thank you. We would love to have you back.
I'm always up for a good conversation, and Bruce, it was a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm hoping that we can loop around at some point. Dominica, thank you, as always, for your leadership and your vision.
Thanks,
thank you, Bruce, for moderating.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary.
Yeah.
Thank you. And for all of you watching out there, this is just one of many of webinars that we're planning here at Latinos in Society. We want to bring cutting edge leaders, ideas to help you innovate and connect you to one another. So I encourage you to visit our website, follow us on social media, Aspen Latinos, at our Twitter account, and send us an email in terms of the kind of programming that you would like to see. Today, we heard a conversation about being architects of our future. Well, to plan that future, we have to be those architects of change ourselves. So we invite you to walk alongside Latinos in Society as we build out the Aspen City Learning and Action Lab. I want to thank the staff, Alejandro Manzanares, Eddie Encinales. Please reach out to them. They will be your first contact. And really, we're here to provide you connections and technical assistance as best we can. So thank you. Have a prosperous, healthy, and safe 2022.